Hello, everyone. Welcome to another awesome day of video training. This is Richard Carlton here. There we go. I am on video here eventually. FMtrain.tv, where every day we're doing great training. We're learning a lot about building great applications with the FileMaker platform. And so we are broadcasting in high definition on Twitch, YouTube, and Discord. And so let me hit the button here. If you go to the website, you can see, if you select the live training tab right here, you can scroll down and see the upcoming broadcast schedule. Today, we're going to be joined by, or are being joined by, Leland Long, who will be momentarily jumping in and talking to us about more JavaScript, JSON, that kind of shenanigans. In fact, he's going to have the recurring slot here. I think mostly Thursdays. We'll see how that goes, but the idea is for him to be here weekly to talk to us. Friday, Christian Schmidt will be here tomorrow to talk about the Monkey Bread plugin with some OCR action. Then Nick, by the way, I got pictures of Nick in Greece. He's got functional internet. Everything seems to be functional, so we're all thumbs up because he was supposed to be here this week, and he said he was stuck on a boat, on a ferry going to Greece, whatever. So it was a long, sad story, but it seems to be all coming together, so we're very happy that he will be back doing hot air balloon action with Kin. So there, it's kind of a rebuilding project with hot air balloon Kin, and as Nick goes through it, his works on it, and he finds problems and he struggles to correct things. By him struggling and learning, it slows him down, and it's very educational for everyone else who watches him. So it's a really, people really like it. They're learning a lot from it. So let's talk about Leland Long a little bit here real quick. So if you go to fmtrain.tv, headquarters of our training, in fact, I got notification from a certain organization that told me that the Nielsen ratings were out for last week. Last week was sweeps week for the FileMaker consultancies, and we swept all the important demographics. We even beat CNN in the time slot for live FileMaker TV at 1 o'clock Pacific time. So we're very excited by our high Nielsen ratings on that. Very, very excited. So if you go to fmtrain.tv, you can see the upcoming schedule. Also, you can check out the bundles. If you want to support the channel, make sure that you purchase one of our training bundles. We have training bundles, kind of low, medium, and high. Very, very, very high quality training. This training is being updated for FileMaker 2023. And so we're going to go through and identify the videos that maybe need updating. But Claris keeps adding to the platform. They really don't rip things out. So everything you've already learned is valid, but there's some new additional things. Plus, they changed the icon of the product, etc. So yeah, so we have to do some cleanup on that. For those of you who are subscribers, be patient. All those things are coming to you fairly soon. So real quick, if we talk about here at the top, there's only one person that comes to our live streams that has their own tab on the fmtraining.website, and that's Leland. This should say Leland right here, okay? And if you click on here, this is where you could come check out his training. Now, this was his paid training course that he has here. What we need to do is actually, Margaret, make a note. We want to jump actually to the page that's over here. This is the page that you can get to. It has all his previous free training on here. Plus, we're adding the additional training that he did last week. This week, they're going to get dropped in here. As Leland adds additional free training here, people can access it on this page. It's also cross-posted to YouTube. But if you go to YouTube, when I go to YouTube, all it tells me about is helicopters that I can fly, fighter jets I can fly. I don't fly fighter jets, but I do fly helicopters, and the cute kitties that need to be rescued. Right? That's what and I'm instantly like, why would I watch Leland with JavaScript when I can look at cute kitties or helicopters? They're programmed to get inside my head so I don't do anything useful. So I prefer to watch videos. Like if you watch these, there will be no cute kitties or helicopters, mostly. So that is very exciting. Now down below here, some of you are still buying the training. In fact, I had to cut another check to Leland yesterday. A number of people continue to buy the training. So if you watch the basic, the free JavaScript 101 training here, and then we get to this next section down here where it's paid. We talk about taking JavaScript and building a React Native applications, using code to build an application on Android. I think that's the biggest market for that. But you can also code it once, and it should work on iOS as well. So that's pretty powerful. So if you want that training, you can come down here. You can buy that training. In fact, here at the top, you can see you buy the training. Once you buy the training, you get the license key, which turns on the videos down here, right? Makes sense because I'm sorry, you get this little note. Please go up the top and buy his training. So that is Leland. So Leland Long, you are here with us today. We are very honored and thrilled that you are here. Most of us need this training except for Kyle. Kyle Williams could provide this training. So that's Kyle. He's good like this, like you are. All right, so Leland, where are we at? I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Where are we going today?
Today is pretty much a follow-up from my class 2 weeks ago on JSON. Hopefully everybody that made it to that class is here for a follow-up. We didn't title it JSON Part 2, but that's in essence what it is. Margaret looks like she's already shared the link on Discord. I'm assuming it's gone out everywhere. That's to this GitHub page that you see on my screen now. Mm-hmm. And that gives you the demo file that we'll be going through in this particular class, which looks about like that. So the last class we had was JSON 101, and we learned how to read it. We learned how to write it. We had our feet gently introduced lightly. We got our feet wet lightly just by exploring a little bit of JSON, and now what we're doing is finding a way to work on a little bit more advanced concepts with JSON. In other words, let's use it actually in FileMaker. So one of the best places, in my humble opinion, that you can use that nowadays is with a fairly new script step that we've been introduced to in FileMaker called Execute Data API. And you may or may not be a user yourself of FileMaker's data API externally, where you can, from an external source, either share it with a vendor or have some sort of web service interact with your FileMaker server. But if you have anyone else or yourself trying to work with FileMaker data that's in an external server, you would use the new data API, which before that we would have called custom web publishing. And we would have been talking with a language called XML, and we might have been using technology like PHP. But that is all pretty much behind us now. It's still in use. Will probably be deprecated at some point. That's an opinion, not a fact. So it might stay around for a while. It might disappear. But the data API, at least, is the current solution in Claris FileMaker world as far as speaking with your FileMaker server externally, either by yourself or by others. So Execute Data API was introduced well after the Data API was available, and this is actually available in a local file or a hosted file, and it allows you to pretty much do the same thing that you can do externally to get FileMaker data out or in, but now you can do it within your script. So if you've never heard of it before, that's kind of maybe a poor way of phrasing exactly what it does, but here on the screen you can see basically straight from the documentation from Claris that it uses the same underlying functionality as the FileMaker Data API on a hosted file. You request the data from the current file and you receive back your data in JSON format. And the request is a simple JSON object rather than the external data API, which would require a URL, a header, request body, and so forth. So when you're doing this inside your script, you can get rid of all of that, keep it really simple. And if you haven't seen the parameters for this particular script step, there's 3 parameters: select, target, and request. The first few screens here, we're mostly just kind of going through some boilerplate documentation, get kind of an understanding of what we're doing before we actually go play. So this would be the first slide. This would be slide number 2. Now this is straight from the documentation. This looks like a lot of data, but really what this is this is a list of options. These are all optional. Well, some of them might be required, but these are the options you can pass in as one of those parameters. So this gives you an idea of what you can pass in. And the next screen includes a few things that you might expect to have to use, but actually are not passed in. So we will use a few of these today, not all of them, but just to go through a few of them. When you're dealing with the web or data API, you typically have versions. And so FileMaker has, for quite a while now, made 3 options for the version, and that's V1, V2, and V latest. Your layout is a required field, and we'll go through examples of that and what that means if you don't understand that right out of the gate. Your query is what we'll spend most of our time dealing with today. Sort is an option that some people like to use, some people don't, or it's on a case-by-case basis. It depends upon whether or not the data that you get back needs to be sorted or not. But FileMaker, well, I almost said server, will do that for you. The script step will handle the sorting for you if you do request that. Limit we'll explain here in a little bit, and pretty much the rest of it is optional. You can play with it. You can look at it in documentation. You can get kind of a grasp on what it does, or if and when in the future you need to do something a little bit more advanced with the script step, the documentation, which is where this comes from, is of the utmost importance.
Yes. Quick question. Can I use this to have an on-prem FileMaker server get data from a FileMaker server in the cloud?
If I understood the question correctly, the answer is absolutely yes. That sounded like from one FileMaker solution to another FileMaker solution. And so yes, when you're talking to that external FileMaker solution, the data API is what you want to use. This execute data API would not be used in that case because this is local only. So this is a local ability of using the data API, where scratch out the word execute and the whole topic of data API is what you would be using to talk to an external FileMaker data source.
Does that answer your question, Lynn?
Hopefully that answers that question. The next slide that I'll jump to while we have more questions pouring in is these are the these are the keys that are ignored. So you don't use database. These would be used potentially in the data API, but in execute data API, these are not used. You don't have to worry about authorization. You don't have to worry about your content type. You don't have to worry about databases, and you cannot have a script step calling a script step using the execute data API. You would just use perform script step in that case. And there's just a few little gotchas or notes that FileMaker included in their documentation, and I'll just briefly color them down here. And that is, when this script step is performed, it actually operates on a hidden window using the layout that's specified.
Oh, interesting.
And then that window is closed when everything is done. Did you have a question, or was that a comment? I missed it.
I'm just commentating because
Okay.
I've been requested to commentate
Excellent.
in lieu of Richard. So you're going to get me giggling and making like, ooh, shiny object comments in the background.
Squirrel. Yeah, good.
Uh,
So since we have a hidden window that pops up with a layout, the next question that might come to your mind is, oh, well, what about script triggers? And this next point covers that. Those are disabled. So if you have script triggers on that particular layout, those will not be utilized when this script step is run. Same thing with error reporting dialog boxes. And the last note here is if the file is hosted rather than local, now that would again be hosted by the same server that this file is associated with or being hosted on. So as long as you're on the same server, if you're using this execute data API to be talking between files on the same server, for instance, when you're dealing with container data, you're actually going to get back a URL. But if you're just using this locally, then you're going to get back container data. Or actually, I think you return the file name. Yeah, the name of the file in the container field. So that's just applicable to container data. And with that, we've got one more slide before we start playing. And this is an example of a response that you would get back. And this is really the reason why I wanted to go ahead and play around with execute data API for this particular class, because this is JSON being returned to us that we want to use our skills that we're learning with JSON's last class and today to understand how to get out of it what we want. So here's an example of what we get back. It's basically in 3 sections. The first section is a server message or just a local message, whichever way you want to look at it. Then you have your data being returned in an array. So this particular example shows one array element, which would mean there's only one record coming back. And then our third batch of data that we get back is data info. And that gives us some useful metadata information like the layout that was used, the database that was used. And the 3 that we are really interested in is the total record count in the table, the found count of what was found using the query, and then finally how many records were actually returned to us. And you'll notice that in this particular case, even though it found 3, we only got 1 back. That is intentional. And that means that they actually requested only 1 record to be returned. So had that restriction not been in place, we would have gotten back 3 records. So that's a lot of talking before we get into actually playtime. What do we got for questions? Have we answered everything that we needed to?
JSON that changes. Need to use list keys to find where the key is to find the value? Question mark.
You could, but since you are requesting a layout to be used with this particular script step, that means you're going to get back everything on that layout. So if the layout doesn't change, your JSON keys are not going to change where they are or what they're named. So if you have layout changes, well, then your response is going to change applicably. So you may or may not find the need to use list keys. I don't actually use it much myself. I haven't had a case where I've needed to because I'm the solo developer typically on the project that I'm working on. So I know what the keys and values are. You know, I know what the JSON payload is going to look like when I get it. I'll either have examples or live test data or something so that I know exactly the field mapping that needs to happen. And that's typical for your vendors too, right? If you're doing an API query of an outside vendor, whether it's Google or anyone else, they're going to post changes if there are any. And you'll know exactly in documentation what to expect. So typically to do a list keys is probably what you would need to do if documentation was not available, or you didn't want to bother reading the documentation and you just wanted to wing it. Then you would want to list your keys.
How dare you tell me to read the instructions?
That's right. So with that, the rest of the database contains the same sample data that I've used in other classes. This is 1,000 records of semi-random data that was acquired through a paid service. I actually got 1 million records, and for sharing this file with other people, slimmed it down to just 1,000 because that's typically adequate for the class material that we're looking at. So what we're just going to do from now on is play around with this one script step in various fashions against this table, against this particular layout. So you'll notice the layout name is just called sample data, and you'll see that in our examples. So all of the rest of our playtime is going to be in script workspace. We have 5 scripts to look through. Let's start with the first one. Go ahead.
This is really, I should have asked this beforehand. Is there any way that you could very speedily change your thing to light mode instead of dark mode? That works.
I found a magic button.
I'm very sorry for the idea you're about to experience, but it's more readable.
This is blowing my mind now. This is just so wrong. I have used dark mode for so long. I'm not even in FileMaker anymore. This is just wrong.
I'm sorry. I have used dark mode for many years now, and I hate having to swap it. And people are always like, I can't believe you're doing this to me, Margaret. But there's no hope for it. It's much more readable, unfortunately.
This is jarring. That's funny. Okay.
Sorry. We can continue.
Okay. Here in the notes, I've got a reference to documentation, which we'll just quickly jump over to. Well, if I can get my mouse to cooperate, that's links to this right here, which is Claris documentation on the web for the same script step. You'll notice this data looks familiar. It was on one of the slides, so was that data. And then there's a few examples down here. So that is what this reference is here on the script, on all 5 of them actually. So with that, this script is going to be replicated in all 5 of these, but really what we're changing really is the query and how we generate the query, and then the parsing of the response. But pretty much this is in 3 sections, which is this section here handles generating the query right here. Then we use a single script step, execute FileMaker Data API, to actually do the work. And then once we get that data back, it's going to be here in this target of $result. Then we're just simply going to parse it. And in this particular case, what we're going to do is we're going to loop through the returned records and do something with them. And we're just going to exit with the results of basically a report. So that's what all 5 of these script steps are going to do. All of them are going to do that. We're just going to completely change in each of the 5 what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So the first part is the query. This right here is what I typically use to generate a query. This is the entire query in one step. Now, this is efficient. This is nice. Looks nice and pretty. We got tabs we got going. But for JSON or FileMaker 101 students, this could be a little intimidating. So what I'm going to do, this is what we're going to use on script steps 2 through 5. But in this one, I decided let's disable that and let's do the exact same thing, but step by step.
Ooh.
So that's what these are. Okay. So these that are highlighted, these 2, 4, 6 script steps are going to do the exact same thing that this does. So with that, let's see what it is that I'm doing. The first one is we're going to create a JSON object, and we're going to give it one key value pair. And hopefully what I just said is not confusing because you were at my last class, and that should totally make sense to you. Unless you've slept since then and you forgot everything that I said, then unfortunately you're going to have to go back and rewatch it. But when we create JSON objects, we have to give it key value pairs. And in this case, we're giving it one key value pair. The key is layouts. The value is sample data. Then we have to provide it with a type. And instead of using the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I'm using the full-blown name of the type, which is JSON string. So let's actually run this in the script debugger, and let's go to that one first step and look at the data viewer and just make sure that everybody's on board with what it creates. And that should be in your mind when you looked at that JSON script step, this should be what you pictured because this is what it created. One JSON object with one key value pair, layouts, sample data. So hopefully everybody is nodding their head in approval and this is totally making sense. So let's look at the second line. What's the second line? Well, the second line is doing the exact same thing. We're making a JSON object with one key value pair, but with the one difference. Hopefully you notice what the difference is. Instead of starting with a blank nothing, we are passing in the existing JSON object we just created in the last step. So what is this going to do? This is going to take that single object key with one key value pair, and it's going to add a second key value pair to it. And if you've done this before, you're nodding your head in agreement. Yep, totally makes sense. If you haven't done this before, you're kind of going, what did he just say? Well, let's run it in the debugger and see what it looks like. After we do that second step, this is our final result. One object, cell, but now it has two key value pairs. The first one from script step number 23. And this is the second key value pair that we got from step number 24. So at this point, hopefully nobody is lost because it'll just get more complicated from here on out. But this is pretty simple stuff so far. So hopefully everybody's keeping up. Go ahead.
I was going to ask, before we moved on and assumed that everyone is along for the ride, do we have any questions? If you were like, man, this is really confusing, ask the question and we'll be able to determine from the question if Leland can answer it now or if I can direct you to the according video that you need to watch in order to get what's going on. So I'm letting people aren't typing, so I assume that we're okay. So
hopefully that doesn't mean they're all asleep with their face on the keyboard.
Well, at least they would be typing then, you know?
Yeah.
I would see it. So they're not passed out as far as I can tell. So we're free to keep going.
So I've explained the technical FileMaker creating a JSON object with two key value pairs. The one thing that I haven't done is I haven't explained why I'm making these key value pairs. Well, let's look at these separately. The first one was layout. Now, if you recall from the slide, and if we look back in documentation, that was this parameter right here. This describes the layout that you want to use for your query. So this would be the equivalent in standard FileMaker script steps as go-to layout. So this is the layout that we want the query to do the query on, and it was sample data. And that is the name of our layout that we have in the solution. The second one is limit, and that one's definitely optional. And you'll notice here in the documentation that if you leave limit out, it defaults to 100. And this is the number of records that should be returned. And it's a max value, right? So if you have a limit of 1,000 and your records only return 3, you're going to get 3 back. You're not going to get 1,000. So it's just a max value. This is useful for just controlling how many you get back based upon the business logic of what it is you're trying to accomplish. If you know that you need several hundred records to come back, you need to put a limit in because the default is 100. I've been caught a couple times myself over the last couple of years with that one. Got a mobile app out there that uses the data API, which uses the same limit default. And all of a sudden I get complaints of users saying, how come I only have the first 100 records and I'm not seeing everything after that? It's like, oh, oops. Yeah, I forgot to increase the limit beyond 100. So keep that in mind. In this case, we're passing in a limit of what? We're passing in a limit of 2. So at this point, we know as the developer, I'm going to expect 2 records or less. All right, moving on. The next one is going to create a brand new JSON object. Here's the final result of what it looks like. And it's another single object with excuse me, it's another JSON object with a single key value pair. The key is a fully, how does FileMaker work? A fully qualified field name. So it has the table name with 2 colons and then the field name. And capitalization and spelling is vital. So in this case, we're looking for the state and we're looking for a key of NY, which, as you know, would stand for New York. So that creates that simple object. This next script step is going to take that same object and add another key value pair to it, just like we did before. So if we look at that after it runs, our second key value pair is last name M. So if you stop and think about this, this is building the query. So what this is doing is this is the equivalent of going into find mode, going into the state field and typing in NY, going into the last name field and typing in M. That's what this is representing. It's the equivalent of that sort of find that you do all of the time in FileMaker. And by the way, that's known as an AND search. It means find me records where the state matches NY for New York and the last name starts with M, or at least has a word in the last name field that starts with M, for those of you that are a little bit more advanced on queries in FileMaker. Okay, now we've got 2 objects with 2 key value pairs in each. What's next? The next is we're going to create an array. The query actually requires an array, and the reason for that is just like FileMaker's find mode, you can actually submit multiple requests.
Oh.
So that becomes an OR search if you have multiple requests. So for instance, if you wanted to include both New York and Florida, you would have to do an OR search. You would need 2 find requests. Your first one would be state NY. The second find request would be state FL for Florida. And that would give you a resulting set of both New York and Florida. It's confusing to say it's an OR search because I just said the word and, right?
I was about to say, so you can't do an AND search with just 2 different types of states. It has to be an OR search in order to get 2 in the same.
It depends upon how you think about the query in your head. And the way that you have to state it correctly in order to understand the binary logic that's going on with the ands and ors is I want to find records where the state matches New York and the last name is M, or I want matches of state Florida and last name of M.
I see.
So that's the correct way to look at that and think your way through, well, is this an AND search or an OR search? Yeah.
Got it.
So when you're building your query with JSON, each object is going to be your AND search, and each array element is going to be your OR searches. So when we're completely done, well, I'll kind of point that out again because that just sounds confusing, let alone. Yeah. So this next script step is going to take our single array element and actually stick it into an array. So let's run that and see what it looks like. Here's our array element. That was the single. Here's the finalized array, which is an array with 1 object in it. And hopefully you can kind of see what I'm talking about there. You have your array because you have your square brackets on the outside, and you have a single object inside represented by the curly brackets. Now, if I did this,
but so you could add another curly bracket object, right? Yeah,
this would be an array with 3 elements in it. And this would mean this would be synonymous with 3 find requests, all in the same find query. Okay. And each one of these requests has a 2-field and request going on, right? So New York and last name starting with M. New York and last name starting with M. So hopefully that's starting to be not quite so fuzzy if this is all new material to you. This next step is going to add the array to our original or finalized query. Here's what the final query looks like now that we're all done. And what I could do now is I could take that query and let's pretty it up and just look at what that would look like if we formatted it properly. And let me make our window a little bigger so we can see it like so. There's what it looks like in human readable format. This is our compiled full query that we're ready to actually throw at the execute data API now. So it contains 3 key value pairs: layout, limit, and query. The query is an array with all of your requests, your find requests inside of that array. In this particular example, we only have one find request, and it's a AND request between 2 fields: last name starting with M, state starting with NY. So hopefully all that makes sense. So that's our finalized query. Now let's run it and see what we get back. Finally, a lot of chatter. Here we are 35 minutes into the show and we finally actually get something. Oh, well. So let's run it. Oh, hey, it's done. Did you notice that was fast? So I want to really point that out, because what you're going to see is that whether we're using a database with 1,000 records in it, but picture a complicated find request that you would normally build. What would you normally do? You only have 2 script steps so far: the query and the execute data API. So let's compare 2 script steps with how you would normally do that. Normally you would say, go to layout, enter find mode, set field last name M, set field state NY, perform find. You would probably want to do some error checking. So you would probably say get variable found count equals get found count. And then you'd probably follow that with an if statement, which would be if found count is greater than 0, then loop through them and do something, right? That would be your standard process of doing things, which is fine, but that requires context. That requires your script to actually stop, change layouts, go perform something, and then do something. You notice that in this case, we've done, except for line 34, we've done nothing but set variables. So this is all in memory. So there's no context swapping. You could do this anywhere, and you wouldn't have to change windows. You wouldn't have to change layouts. So there's some nice tricks that this allows you to perform, and I'll try to point those out as we go along as well. So let's look at the response. What did we get back? Well, here it is. Oh boy. Okay, that looks complicated. Well, let's pretty it up. Matter of fact, rather than FileMaker's pretty it up, I'm going to use a website pretty it up instead. One that you've all seen me use before if you've been to my prior classes. There it is, all prettied up. I'm going to throw that in a text edit so that we can see it and blow it way up big on the screen. And there it is. Matter of fact, that's almost the entirety of it. So you can see when I scroll, there's just a little bit more at the bottom. So here is our 2 records we got back. Okay. So you can see the square bracket ending there, square bracket beginning there at the data. So here's our first record, and here's our second record. Now, why did we get all of this stuff? Well, the answer is you'll get anything that's on the layout that you told it to use. So let's just kind of look at that layout in case you forgot what it looks like. We'll just stop our script here. We'll jump over to here's the layout. Let me go into layout mode. So all of these fields and all of their applicable names is what we have here. Matter of fact, let me put them kind of side by side, and looky there. This field data is coming straight from this layout. So to kind of answer that question we had at the beginning of the class, do I need to do a list keys in order to find the names of all of the stuff that was returned? Well, not if you already know, not if you design the layout and you know what to expect. Okay.
There you go, David.
Now, if I would have put a portal on the layout with related data, that would have showed up here inside portal data. All right. So you will get back portal data if you throw that on the layout as well. So let's look at some of this other stuff that it returned. Well, here's the messages at the bottom. We knew that we would get a message back, right? This is where errors would occur. We would get a code 401 right here if we had no records found, right? That should be pretty straightforward. Now, you might not know what a 401 error is, but I'm assuming if you've done some script work and done some previous fine queries before, you've ended up with no records found, which is a 401 error. So that's pretty common for everybody to experience. Now here at the top, we do have some other data that we do get, and that's that data info. And this is where we want to kind of glance and understand what it's telling us here. Number one, there's the name of the database, there's the name of the layout, there's the name of the table. Okay, that's all well and good. But this part here is something to just pay attention to and just keep it in the back of your mind, because this is where the gotchas happen. This is where you don't get the result, or you made a nice pretty report that somebody was requesting for you to make, and they come back to you a week later and say the report's wrong. Well, thanks. What do you mean it's wrong?
Found
And go ahead.
Returned 2. That's odd.
Mm-hmm.
Why would it only return 2? I guess is the obvious question leading up to that.
That's a good one, and I'm glad you caught that, because that's one of the gotchas, right? We only got 2 records back. What if you think that that's the only match, right? And so that's where this becomes really important to pay attention to. The total record count in the database, in the table, not the database, is 1,000. Our found count was 10. We only got 2 back. Why is that? Well, hopefully somebody out there is raising their hand going, ooh, call on me. I know what the answer is.
Is it because of the limit?
It's because of this limit we put in right here of 2. Okay. So as you know, I can go in here and change this to 20 and rerun it. And let's just have it stop at the same place that we were, which is right here, so that it runs and we get back the response. And here's the result. Ooh, it's a lot more. So let's copy that into our pretty it up function over here, paste it in there, process it, copy the whole thing, dump it into a text field. There we go. Now we got a found count of 10 and a return count of 10. And now if we scroll, there we go. There's all 10 of them. Okay. So hopefully that little gotcha is something that you will remember from here on out. If you take nothing else away from the class, you can remember, well, I better pay attention to the return count, not necessarily the found count, because they might differ. And if so, you're not going to have the result you were anticipating.
A speedy question that is
Go ahead.
somewhat related. Can you search a field that's not on the layout? My assumption is yes, is the person saying.
I think FileMaker itself totally allows that. There's a few exceptions to that rule where it doesn't work.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, that even if the field isn't visible, as long as it's on hiding off in a corner somewhere, you can still search in it.
Right. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm willing to quickly go in here and find out.
See what happens.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, let's kill the last name field, since that's what we're already searching by. Were we, or did we do a search by first name?
No, we're doing last name, I thought.
Query right here, sample data. Oops, that's the state. And here, last name. So with that, let's kill let's leave the label there. We don't need to get rid of that. So we'll kill that. Okay, we now have no field on the layout. Let's rerun and stop there. And we get the same found count 10, return count 10 out of 1,000. So yeah.
Cool.
Still worked. Good question. I didn't want to speculate and say, oh yeah, it's totally fine. And then all of a sudden find out, oops. So we will resolve that really fast, just like that. Oh, 2 labels now. There we go. Okay, back to where we started. Good question. Thanks. Keep them coming. Okay, back to the script. So we got the results. Here's what the results look like. Anything else to point out here? You do get the record ID back, which you never asked for, but you'll always get it back. And by the way, if you want to ever do any edits, now you can't do an edit in Execute Data API. That's just for queries. But if you use the actual data API externally and you want to perform an edit or a delete or anything besides create one, you will need to pass in the record ID. And that's what FileMaker uses to know which record to make the edit in. So this is where you get it. So if you're getting it, you might want to store it. Or in this case, for Execute Data API, you can actually ignore it. It won't do you a whole lot of good. Anything else before we move on? If anybody's curious, there's a mod ID here. That is really useful if you want to do something like syncing or editing, because what'll happen is FileMaker increments this mod ID secretly hidden behind the scenes for every record. And it just increments from 0 to 1 to 1,000,000 to 10,000,000. It increments by 1 every single time any edit is performed on the entire record. What does that do for you? Well, if you do a data pull like this and you get back a mod 0, and later you want to do an edit, what you should probably do first is do another request for the same data and check the mod ID. If it's the same, the data is still the same as the last time you saw it. But what if that's a 10-minute break, right? And what if somebody else has gone in and edited the record since you had it last? That makes your data dirty or invalid. If your mod ID from your first poll does not match the mod ID of your second poll, that data has changed. So now you don't want to submit a new edit, because now you're going to potentially wipe out something, a change that someone else has made. So you're going to want to grab the fresh data first and have your user edit that. So that's a complicated example, but that gives you an idea of what this mod ID can actually be useful for. Okay, so with that, let's move back to where we were. We've gone down a few distracted tunnels, but those were good tunnels, so I'm glad we did. So this next part, what we're going to do is we're going to parse through the response. And matter of fact, let me just do this, because in this first script, I'm doing it again step by step so you can kind of see what's going on. So let's bring up the data viewer and the script debugger. And this first variable is going to say, hey, grab me the response, but I'm only, well, yeah, grab me the entire response. Well, no. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm contradicting myself. If you look here, the root of our data is inside this key value pair response. So that's what this variable is doing, is say, hey, grab me the response out of everything else. What that'll do is that'll strip out anything and everything outside the response, which would be the messages. So this is going to strip out messages. This is going to return just the response, if that makes sense. So let's do that. Let's run that script step. Now we have just the response, no messages. The second one is say, hey, from that response, grab me just the data info. So what is that? Well, that's this section up here. It's just going to grab just that. So let's do that. And here it is down here, data info. And now that's pretty small, right? Out of that entire response, this is just that. From that, we can grab the found count because it's sitting right there. So let's grab the found count. There it is. And it's 10, just like we were expecting. And this is where you're going to want to pay attention to whether or not that found count is actually what you were anticipating, right? Because you might want to actually look at the return count, but that's debatable, case by case basis. Now what we're going to do is we're going to loop through those 10 records and we're going to do something with them. So what is it we're going to do? Well, let's look. The first thing we're going to do is get the last name of the first record. So there it is right there, McLeod. And if we look at our data, back to the first one, right here, we should have a last name of McLeod right there. So this grabbed. Now, how did I do that? Yeah, let's look at quickly how I did that. How did I grab that first one in the list? Well, that looks complicated, doesn't it? So we better cover this. I covered this a little bit in the last class, but let's kind of go back over it. This is looking at the entire result now. So in that entire result, the first thing we want to do is pull the response. This one right here. From that, using the dot syntax, I want to pull the data. So that's this data here, which is a key value pair inside this response object. Now this data is going to be an array of objects, right? So from that, what do I want? Which index do I want? By the way, how do you pull an index out of an array? You use the square brackets, right? Just like you would for repeating fields. And which index do I want? I want the index that we're going to be changing as we loop through this, starting at 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the very first record is going to be index 0. So this inserts data bracket 0. And that gives me the entire record. Now that gives me this. That's what that's going to return. Now what do I want from this? The first thing I want is that field data. So then dot field data. And that returns this object right there. And this object has a whole bunch of key value pairs. Which key do I want? I want the last name key. So that's this one here. So this one command out of all of that result grabs me the very first last name at index 0 of the return data. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, go back and watch JSON part 1 because we covered all this. So that's how I got the current the first value of last name. Then I'm going to create my own little custom list. And I'm just going to take the existing list and add the current last name to it. Now, as you know, since the first list is blank, my very first item in my list is going to be that last name, McLeod. There we go. Then I'm going to bump up the index by 1 and keep going as long as I'm not past my found count, which is 10. So this is going to loop through, and let's do that. Loop through. What's the end result? A last name list. There they are, 10 last names. That was the end result of this entire script. Okay. From here on out, we're going to speed up. That was a step-by-step walking through a very complicated, potentially complicated process. Step-by-step trying to understand exactly what we were doing and why. Up here, we created the query. And again, from now on, we're just going to do that same query, but in this format, which is in one step rather than a whole bunch. But hopefully, since I walk through it one by one, it'll totally make sense to you now what this is doing. And before we run it, we'll take a look at what it generates, just so you can say, oh yeah, okay, I get it. Then we're going to generate the result from our execute data API. And then we're just going to parse through the response. And from now on, we're going to do the same thing. We're just going to go through, we're going to look at last names, and we're going to create a list of last names, and that's going to be what our end game is. That's our goal. Okay. So before I move on to numbers 2 through 5, do we have any questions flowing in?
Yes. With portals, how do you know where to find since they could change?
How do you know where to? They're going to come back as an array, just like your found record set. So you're going to get, if you have one portal on the layout, you're going to have the name of the portal sitting there. You would see it in the response. And then you're going to have an array with results. And so if you have 5 items in the portal, you're going to have an array with 5 elements in it, just like you have an array here, a data array with 10 records in it, right? So you're going to have portal data here. If you just have one portal on the layout, you're going to have an array in here. And if there's 5 items in the portal on this record, you're going to have 5 elements. And this one might only have 3. And the next portal might only have 0, right? It's going to be however many related records are inside that portal. Good question. But yeah, if you saw it, it would probably make more sense. And unfortunately, I thought that was a little advanced here to do related data. But I would say for your homework, go ahead and go to a table that has a portal on it and run a quick execute data API call on it using the skills that you've learned today as far as generating the query, and look at the results and look at the portal data and nod your head and go, oh yeah, totally makes sense. Do you have to value count for portal data? I believe yes. I don't think you get a count in your portal data. See, in data info for your general record count, you do get a found count and a return count. So in portal data, you might not, which would mean you would need to do a value count on the returned results. Yeah. So if there was 5 objects in there, you would want to know that you have 5 so that you could loop through them and pull data, right? Yes. Okay. I think that's it for questions. Moving on to number 2. So this one looks a lot smaller, but it does the exact same thing with one slight change. Okay, here's our single query. Should look familiar to you. There's our single execute data API, and this parsing is exactly the same as before. So this is almost the same script, but much more condensed. Okay, so what have we done? Well, really all I did is I changed the limit in here. So I'm going to go back to here and change this 20 back to 2. Because, yeah, we kind of jumped ahead on what I was showing everybody. Because if you run this script as is, run it, and look at the result, we only get back 2 last names. And the answer was exactly like Margaret pointed out. She's the one that made us jump ahead. That was funny. In this case, you only got back 2. And the question is, why did I get 2 when there was probably more found? And the answer was because we placed a limit on it. So that was number 1. Number 2 does the same exact search, but it advances the limit to 20, just like we did on the last one. So if we run this, we should get back a last name list of 10. There they are. Okay. So we actually just blew past example number 2 really fast.
It's like
We'll move on to 3. So 3 is exactly the same, but what we've done here is we've added a sort option. Ooh, that looks kind of scary, doesn't it? Well, if you look carefully, this is identical. This is the query. These two are identical. This is what we added. And it's just exactly the same as the query. The key value pair is sort and then your JSON array. So we're building an array with one object in it. And it's got 2 pieces of information that are important, which is what field do you want to sort by, in this case, last name. And then you have to supply the sort order, descend, ascend, so I picked ascend, okay? So it looks kind of complicated, but really that's the only thing that's changing, is we're just adding a sort. And if we run that and look at the result, last name list, you'll notice that all of those are alphabetized.
Alphabetical, yep.
Yeah. So that was pretty straightforward. The next script is almost exactly the same, but we've added an OR search. So this looks a little bit more complicated. Ooh. With the sort.
So you're going to get Florida and New York.
So this one, all of this data is the same as the last one. All we've done is we've adjusted the existing query to now have 2 elements instead of 1. So here's the first element in our object, which is our New York M. But this is where we've added a comma at the end of the object and added another object in there, which is another key value pair and search of state Florida and last name M. So this is exactly the same as what we've done before, but now instead of just getting New York, we're going to get New York and Florida, but they all have to be last names starting with M. By the way, what's our limit? I've limited it to 20. Let's see if that makes a difference. Let's run it. And there's our last name list of, that probably doesn't look like 20, does it? So let's look at the result. What did we actually get? Found count was 13. Okay, so our last name list is just 3 more than we had before. So that tells you that there was only 3 Florida records that had the last name starting with M. And they're all alphabetized together along with...
I was about to say, they're together in terms of alphabet. Could you alphabetize them separately?
Oh, now you're getting evil.
I'm sorry, I'll be quiet.
What you would have to do is you would have to run that same query twice, one for each state, then just concatenate the 2 lists.
Okay.
So a bit more work on that request. You were trying to trip me up. Good catch. Nice try.
We have a quick comment on portals, which I will read out real quick. A gotcha with portals is to make sure you have the allow scrolling set to on, or it will limit the number of related records shown in the portal.
It would definitely limit it on the layout. So that means that without testing it, that means what they are stating as fact, if that's true, that if you're limited to only, let's say, 5 portal records on the layout and you can only see 5, if you don't have scrolling turned on, if there's actually 15 in there, you're stating that the execute data API would only return 5 and not 15. That's interesting. That if that is true, then that shows you exactly how FileMaker is using the layout to totally dictate what you get back. That's interesting. I have not tested that. I can neither confirm nor deny that that is an accurate statement.
It is an interesting comment, though.
Yeah. So that would be an interesting thing to test to verify.
Quick other question from David Angel. The limit is 30K for storing in a variable?
That's a FileMaker limitation. So whatever that limit is, a 30.
I think
okay. That 30K limit is if you're putting data inside a variable. I think you can blow past that. If something like a data API returns you results, it's going to bypass that restriction. That is purely, as far as I know, that's purely a data entry restriction. Because, and I can kind of confirm that because in my JavaScript classes that I gave you, you can append insert text multiple times to the same value. It will keep adding to that variable, but you can only put in 30K at a time. But you can end up with a variable that has 300K in it. You just have to do it 10 times, right? Because the script data entry restricts you to 30K.
Yeah, okay. David Angel confirms that he received a JSON with 2 base 64 that surpassed the limit.
Okay, that may or may not have been the reason why. because I've tried to pass 3 megabytes worth of data and it worked. So I don't think 30K is limited in a variable. I think it's just data entry. But anyways, your mileage may vary. Yeah. So interesting thoughts to ponder. We do have one script left to play with before we can really open it up to questions and
That's the whole list.
deal with things. And this is, I really wanted to show you, in that previous example, we were creating a list of last names, right? Well, I've had in my own personal experience, I've had the need to create a dynamic query based upon a field or a set of fields or some criteria of some sort, to where every time I ran the query, it was a different set of query points. It all had the same built-in logical structure, kind of like so far we've always been doing New York last name starting with M. Florida start with last name starting with M, right? So that logic is being applied to multiple states. So this is taking the same thing a little bit further. This is saying, hey, what if we give it a list of states? And it has to generate that query for every state, but that includes last name starting with M, right? So that's kind of a dynamic query, and that's what we've got going on here. This is what it looks like. This should scare the living daylights out of you if you're not used to this, because this includes a while loop.
Oh.
So you can totally do this in several script steps. You can do it with a standard loop. You could slowly build your query, just like we kind of did, you know, on number 1. Instead of one script step, we broke it out into several easier to follow logical chunks, step by step, building the thing. You can do the same thing here, but this is kind of fun to play with and build, and I'll show you step by step how we can play around with this. But let me show you the end result first. Let's go ahead and run this. Oh, not run. I guess I needed to debug because I turned my debugger off. There we go. We want to actually see the results. So the resulting last name list looks like this, and it's got a whole bunch. Okay. Matter of fact, it has 367 last names in it. Okay. Now remember, we had a database with 1,000 records, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's the state list. We're going to use 4 states. And here's what the query actually looked like after all of that ran. And I prettied it up. And so this should totally make sense to you.
Yes.
Now, this was not limiting the last name. This was actually finding all records. So this found all records for New York, Florida, California, Texas. We didn't actually limit it to last name. That's why we got so many. But you can see how what it's doing is that while loop is creating one object per state. That's all it's doing. But because I'm using a while loop, that means you can pass in as many states as you want, and it just does the same thing, whether it's 0 states or 50 states. So that's the advantage of thinking through and building it that way, is that then you can have a dynamic query generated. That's kind of cool.
You don't have to write a unique one for each state.
Exactly. That could be rather painful. So that's the end result. Now let's just kind of play around with, well, how the heck did you build it? And while I was building this for the class, I realized that really the fun way to build it is in your data viewer. And let me show you what I mean. So this script is still running, which means that while it's still running, I've just got it paused, we still have access to all of these variables, okay? So we have the dot result, which is the entire response. We have the state list here, which is the states we want to use. And what we're going to do is we're going to generate this query in the watch variable section right here. Okay. So let me go back and copy the heavy stuff. I'm going to copy all of it for starters, but then we're going to wipe out part of it and rebuild it. So I'm going to take this whole monster and put it in the watch variable section, like so that we get the exact same result. Okay. Let me make this just a little taller, maybe like that. Well, that cuts off too much. My screen is shrunken due to Margaret's desire for a lower resolution. Normally I can see it all. Yeah.
It's all my fault this stream.
And it's all black text on white screen. Oh, it's just foreboding. Okay. So let's go back to this while loop and let's just shorten it up a wee bit, break it for a while. Let's try that. Let's try this.
It's still mad.
And let's come back with, what should we come back with? I probably got rid of the wrong thing. We do need that. Let's just return index for now. Okay. So here it is totally broken, right? So we've got everything around it that we need. We got the layouts, we got the limit, we got an empty query, we've got the sort. So all of this is still containing everything that we need for the final result. The only thing that I've totally messed up is the query. And so for the query, what I've done is I've just stripped this while statement down to kind of a bare minimum, right? Now, if you've used the while function would be probably the correct name. If you've used this function at all, you know it comes in 4 parts. You have, matter of fact, if we just type in while down below and let it autofill, that's what it looks like from documentation, right? So you have 4 parts. You have the initial variable, you have your condition, you have your logic, and you have your result. So that's these 4 sections here, right? There's the init variable, which right now I only have doing one thing. We're going to add more to it. Here's the condition. That's the second parameter. Our third parameter is right here. That's the logic. And then finally, our result is right here. So this is exactly the same as this right now with just a little custom stuff thrown in. Okay. So if you haven't used it or you haven't seen it used quite in this fashion, hopefully you're following along going, oh, okay, well, don't know where you're going with this, but so far what you've got makes sense. Okay. And it looks like I broke something because I'm not getting a result, which is probably this bad boy right here. There we go. I'll just comment that out. Okay, so back to this while loop. So our initial variable we're setting indexed equal to 0. Our condition says as long as index is less than 1, then do this loop. Okay, so in this case it's just going to run once, right? Our logic states, hey, while you're looping, every time you run through this once, take the index and add 1 to it. And then our result passes back whatever it is that we want. So this is going to be our query when it's all said and done, right? So the purpose of our while loop right here is to generate an array with key value pair objects inside of it. So at this point, that shouldn't be confusing. Okay, so now we can just build this. And what's kind of cool with building it here in this format right here in the watch section of the data viewer is that you get an immediate result down below of exactly what your calculation is currently providing you. So it's instant feedback while you're building this while loop. Matter of fact, if you make one error, your result goes away. So you just know, oops, whatever I just did broke it. Right?
So you don't have to like go back and go like, wait, did I add a space somewhere?
Yeah. So this is kind of a cool little place to build a function, especially a complicated function like a let function or a while. Yeah. Because you can see the result instantaneously as long as you have this automatically evaluate turned on. Now there is a gotcha. I recommend while you're playing around in here that you turn that automatically evaluate off, because if you accidentally create an infinite loop, you ain't getting out of it. You are locking up, you are locking up FileMaker with a spinning beach ball, and you ain't going to be able to do nothing except sit back and take a very extensive coffee break while you stare at a beautiful spinning beach ball. So, and I've done that so many times. It's like, oh, I forgot to turn that off. Yeah. So imagine if it said, if continue while index is greater than 0, right? I mean, you do that and you've got a hopeless case. I mean, you might as well, yeah. So turn that bad boy off. There's the gotcha right there. So I'll actually turn that off and I'll ping evaluate when it makes sense. All right. So we want to build a query of JSON objects. So right here in my business logic, while I'm indexing, adding my index greater than 1, before I do that, I want to use the current index. So right here, I want to do something like result equals JSON set element. And I want to create, for now, I'll just create an empty JSON element. And in my key index path, I'm just going to put hello. And for, well, let's Yeah, and for value, I'll say world. And what's that type? That's a string. So JSON string. And now as long as I put a semicolon at the end of that and I don't have one here, that should be valid. And if I hit evaluate, nothing's broken. Okay. Now, if you don't quite understand what I just got through saying, when you have square brackets with multiple entries, your last entry cannot have a semicolon. All other entries have to be separated by semicolons. And if you look at an example like what FileMaker gives you on a function, that makes sense. All of these are separated by semicolons, but you can't have a trailing semicolon at the end. That's what I'm saying in essence, right? So that rule still applies when you have square brackets with multiple entries inside, okay? So that's why this does not have a semicolon and this last entry does not have a semicolon, but this one does. All right, that was a side tunnel for sure. This is supposed to be JSON and execute data API, and here we are going through a while loop. But to me, this is kind of cool. So hopefully this is valuable for our audience. Do we have any actual execute data API or JSON questions going on besides this detour into a while loop?
Sheagle mentions that you forgot curly brackets, braces.
Yeah, but right now, yeah. Now, if they're talking about here, it's optional here. This results in the same thing as this, and that's in documentation. Yeah, if you leave it out, it'll default to an object with curly braces, so that's optional. Now, if you want to create an array, that's required. You can't leave that out, because if you leave it out, it would be an object instead of an array. So if that's what you meant by curly braces, yeah.
That is indeed. They said they didn't know that. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so we have that. Now let's return the result and see what we get back. So let's run evaluate. And we get nothing back. So we obviously still don't have what we thought we had. So why didn't we? That's interesting. Oh, because I'm telling it it's an array and it's not, it's an object. If we turn this into a JSON object, we should get back a single object in our query, which is not a valid query. See, there we go. That's not a valid query because it needs to actually be in an array. But so far now we're actually seeing what we did here. That's the only reason I temporarily turned that array into an object. Okay, so you can see immediately this change right here and this change here, what we're getting. And you're just kind of dynamically building it, right? And you don't have to sit here and go through the script debugger and play and run and reset and do all that fun stuff. You can just do it right here in the data viewer. I think that's pretty cool. Okay, so let's actually turn this single query into a valid array. There's two ways we can do it. Number one, we can cheat. Hey, since we can cheat, let's cheat. So what we can do is we can just put a square bracket here as a string, ampersand, and at the very end right here, we can say and in bracket. And now if we evaluate, ooh, we broke something. Oh, that's not a square bracket. That is a curly brace. And that's a curly brace. Yeah, that was dumb. And we're still broken. So I put something wrong somewhere. That's the result. That's the beginning. And because now it's not an object. Now it's an array. I have to switch it back to an array. It's always something. There we go. Now we have a valid query. Well, kind of. We don't have a field name hello, so that's going to break, right? So we should, I think if we ran this, we'd probably get a 401 error, or we might actually get.
I kind of want to see that.
We would kind of get a FileMaker error. Well, again, this isn't in the script step. This is in the data viewer, so we can't actually run it as a script, right? But if we were, we'd probably not get a 401. We'd probably get one of the FileMaker errors that says field doesn't exist on the layout because there's not a field name hello there, and it's not fully qualified either.
Or imaginary field.
But if now we can change this hello to an actual something or other, right? So what's our table name? It's sample data, : What's our field name? We want to work with state, and I think it's all lowercase. So let's change world to New York. Now we're getting back to real stuff, right? So now this might work. Now we're starting to get a valid query right here, okay? So we've got one key value pair, which in this particular example is fine. That's all we're going to do. We're not going to do last names. So far we've got this while loop working with a single element. Now we've kind of hard coded it into the while loop. It's not really dynamic yet, but you can see we're starting to actually build a valid query here that would not break if we actually threw it into the execute data API. So from here, we can just start to turn it into more and more of a, for instance, up here in our initialization, I want the state list, right? So let's create our local state list and make it equal to the external state list. Now that's not required, but to me, when I'm using variables inside of a while loop, I like to have them all localized. And this can change to something else. I don't want $state list in several places that I would have to change later if I change my mind on the name of the variable or something, right? So I get, for the initialization init variable section, I like to bring in all of my external variables and give them local variables. Then the local variable names I'll use locally. So hopefully that makes sense. But yeah, for the technical people around amongst us, this would technically be OCD and not technically necessary. So there's our state list coming in. Now we need to know the length of the state list. How many states do we have in it, right? So let's do state count. And how do we determine that? Matter of fact, rather than using the outside variable, let's temporarily create our own. Let's just put in New York and Texas and just leave it at that. So we have our own custom state list that we can replace with that variable later, but this way we can actually see the results, right? So how do we get a state count from a list? Well, we do a value count of our state list. And this is FileMaker 20, and I forgot to put in my MBS plugin, so I don't have auto-filling variable names popping up on me. I'm starting to get kind of used to that. Thank you, Christian. Plug for MBS plugin. So there's our value count of state list. Matter of fact, now down here, instead of returning our result, let's just return state count and see what we get back. What do we get back? We get back a, you did something wrong, dumbhead. What I did is I put a trailing semicolon there. So let's evaluate it again. There we go. So our query of 2 tells us that our state count is 2. See how I did that in the watch variable without having, yeah. I mean, that's just, it's kind of cool to develop this right here because you can get back answers to stuff right away rather than exiting from here, running the script debugger, looking in the data viewer for the state count. Oh, it's 2, then going back and editing your code. Yeah, isn't this simpler? I think so.
It is. I would agree.
Okay, so now we have a state list. Now we have a state count. So now we can change our maximum value to that. Now that we have a hard limit and we know exactly what we want it to be. As long as index is less than that state count, build away. So now we can go back and actually return back our result. Now, we're not building on top of anything and we need to. So instead of creating a raw object every single time, we want to add to an existing object. So what do we want to add to? Our existing result, which means we need to initialize it. Because in a while loop, you have to initialize everything you use later. That was something that took me a while to get used to when FileMaker first, that's different than a let statement. Let statement, you can interchange outside variables and global variables all over the place. In a while loop, you can't. Everything has to be localized. So if you want to bring something in, it has to be done here. You cannot use them in the other sections. So with that, let's bring in right here. What is it I'm bringing in? The result. Yeah, so we're defining our result, end result array, like so. Do I want an array? Yeah, I want an array. Sure I do. Of course I do. So, well, that complicates things. No, we don't. Result is just going to be a list for now. I'm going to eventually have it as an array, but I don't want to jump ahead too far. Let's just make that an empty object and see what we get. So if we do that, what do we get? Ooh, looky what we're getting. We're getting a mess. No, we're not. We're getting one valid query for New York, but only once. So it starts at 0. State count is 2. This is running twice. Why didn't we get back 2 objects or 2 key value pairs? Sorry, what?
Nothing, never mind.
0 and 1 should be less than 2, so it should run twice. This is incrementing after that. I'm missing something and it's not staring me in the face. Sorry for the delay, folks. Let me just change this to +1 and see if we get anything. I don't think that'll do anything. No, it didn't. So, do we have any questions pouring in while I'm sitting here struggling over where my error is?
Don't you need a set element for Texas as well, or am I just being silly? Not
Well,
understanding.
we will eventually. Right now, I'm just hard coding it just because I'm trying to make one change at a time. They're right. Whoever asked that question, the end result is yes, we definitely want to.
Should an index less than an index equal 1,000 to avoid? If you have Discord open, you might want to read that.
I did, and I'm sorry, David, I don't understand your question. Because that's 2, so this should be, a first run should be 0 is less than 2. It should do this. That'll increment index to 1. 1 is still less than 2. We should get 2 results, but we're only getting 1. And this I'm adding to the existing object, so this should be adding multiple items. And I'm passing out the result when I'm done. Good golly, I'm just not seeing it. It's so strange. Let me add a few more states. This should not make a difference, but this should totally change the way that everything is working, but yet it's not. I'm still getting 1 every single time. You know what? This is because it's changing this key value pair 3 times now because I'm passing in the same key. So you can't have multiple keys in an object with the same name. They all have to be unique. That's why. This loop is actually running 3 times, but it's doing the same thing all 3 times. So I need to actually pass this in. I'm going to fake this as an object. So to make this an object, I'm going to put curly braces around the outside of it. Yep, that's where my problem is. Good. So there's the curly braces. They're inside quotes. There's the key value pair on the inside. Now I just need actual quotes there and there. That's good. Now I just have to escape them inside the quote. So that one there, that one there, that one there, that one there. Okay. That means I missed. There's that quote. There's that quote. Oh, this needs to be an object. So that's 0. That's an array. That's that. Let's change this back to an array. Okay. We got 1 that looks really ugly. Now I think I can get rid of the outside brackets because now we're not faking an array. We actually have an array. So now there's a single array with 1 object, but it's treating it as a literal because I said this is a string. Let's turn this to an object. Rerun. Ooh, empty. Yeah, that was lovely. I don't need to spend too much time doing this because I think I'm just going to hit monitor, go back to the original because we know this one works.
What is
so
the original?
Let's look right here. Here's the final result that works. And it's kind of the same thing that I was doing, right? Just different names. We got an index to 0. We got a state list coming in from outside. We have a list count of that state list, and we have a result that's going to be an array. We loop through as long as the index is less than the count of the state list, we're going to loop through. And this is what we're going to do through each loop. We're going to get the current value of state. We're going to create a JSON object inside of an array. There's passing in the object. That's probably where I went wrong before. No, I changed that. And we're passing in legitimate data this time, like someone pointed out. We're passing in the state field name, but the dynamic current state. So whatever state is in the list in each one of those, then we're indexing. Yeah, so the end result, let's run this script one more time and then we'll be done. That
comment said that you haven't set an index in the set element and you're not changing the state via the list.
Yeah, we hadn't changed states yet. We were going to once I had what I had. Yeah, what I was trying to do was do something in between, and it wasn't working. I was messing somewhere. But here's the final result. Here's our last name list, so we know it worked. Here's the query. Here's the query that it generated. So what we just attempted to do live, and I failed unfortunately, was to dynamically create this query based upon a state list that had 4 states in it. So this is the one that works. This is the while loop that works. And you can see what it built. So that right there that's highlighted is the result of that while loop. So what that means is that if you look at the script, here's the state list that we passed in. You can change that, or it could be a list that's actually in a field somewhere in your solution, right? So that could come from anywhere, but as long as it's a value return delimited list of states, this thing generates a query, one for each state. That's the end result. And here's the finalized while loop that actually works, that didn't have something wrong in it. Okay. So that's all I've got to show for you. Hopefully, there's one thing I didn't cover, and I'll just kind of briefly go over it. Back here on step 1, I forgot to point out that we were step by step. No, we did. I did point this out, didn't I? We grabbed the response, we grabbed the data info, and we grabbed the found count. And those 3 steps are the exact same as doing it this way with the dot syntax. So
Yes.
I did cover that. Okay, very good.
I think we're good.
Okay.
Are we good, people?
Yeah, hopefully everybody's shaking their head going, okay. What the end result, the end game for this entire exercise was twofold. Number one, to play around with the execute data API in case you haven't really played around with it much yourself yet to this point. So that's the first thing we did, and we learned kind of the ins and outs as far as what it takes to actually use it. The second thing that we did is play around with was creating the JSON query and parsing the JSON results. So we were getting our JSON experience chops a little bit stronger. A lot more uses of JSON than we did for the last class, for sure. And the one thing I kind of already alluded to this, but I want to reiterate it as kind of a closing statement, which is if you look at this entire script, let's skip these. This is kind of boilerplate. Here's the work that I did. Matter of fact, let's skip the exit script step. Here's the work. Let's turn off everything that's not set variable. That would be that, and that. So you notice that this script, in everything that it does, really only had 4 script steps, with 3 out of the 4 being loop control. That was not set variable. And what does that tell you? What that should tell you is that this is completely, it is not tied to any FileMaker context. This script could be run from anywhere in any table, and you would still get back the same result. Why? Because the query controls the context.
Yeah.
This controls your context right there. And this controls your query inside that context, which is why we had to use fully qualified field names here and in the sort request. So here's your context inside of a set variable, all of your context. Why is that important? Because you can use this script in a multitude of different places and not have to worry about changing FileMaker context. You're not changing layouts. You're not breaking things because a field is not on a layout, or, we tried the query of querying a field that's not even on the layout, right? And our result that we got back was totally tied to whatever was on this layout. Whatever field's on this layout, this is what we get back. And so, I don't know, to me, that's just a really important key thing to point out. It's kind of an advanced concept, but this is context free. And that gives you a lot of power. Use it wisely.
I would agree. That's one of the very first things that I remember, because I have distinct memories of learning FileMaker as a child, and my father attempting to drill the idea of context in my little brain that you can't do anything without context. So having the context be inside of the variable itself offers a lot of options.
Right.
Yeah, the sample file is available. People are coming and asking me for it. Give me a second. I'll copy it over again. I copied it in the initial first 10 minutes, 4 minutes even. So people are asking oh, is it here? Do you have it? People did like the while exposure.
Good.
So
little side topic.
A lot of people have appreciated, said thank you very much for this. We have one last question from Shiegel before I wrap up and let us all free. Is there a cap to the limit of records you could get back?
Realistically, probably. Theoretically, probably not. You're going to be getting back, kind of like someone else was pointing out, you got memory to deal with, right? So you almost say that there's no limit, but man, what about those databases that have 10 million records in it and 100 fields, and several of those fields have boatloads worth of data, you're going to crump. I mean, that's just going to be crazy. So would it technically be capable of trying to process it? Yes, but you're going to have a hard limit, right? So you just kind of have to plan accordingly and just kind of experiment. And kind of like when I was in the watch section of the data viewer and I turned off the execute. Why did I do that? Because while I'm building, I might inadvertently create a problem that I hadn't anticipated. Same thing when you're writing your scripts, right? Same thing when you're running a script that possibly is going to return a huge amount of data. You might want to do that in stages. Just start with a small amount, just keep going up until all of a sudden you reach some hard cap that you decide, I probably want to relook at this and rethink of it because it's killing performance. And another thing, this works lovely on a hosted file. Well, hosted file is over a WAN. So a lot of your memory management and your data pool and your bandwidth are all going to be considerations you have to take into account when you're building this. So again, the standard escape clause is your mileage may vary. So just, go with caution. But technically, is there a limit? Probably not.
I lied. There's another question that Sheagle found for me that I forgot in the midst of watching all the chats. Can you pass containers with DAPI? I'm guessing yes, using base 64 encode.
Well, it depends on what you mean by pass. As a parameter, no. You're not going to do a search against a container, right? So that would be passing because it would all be, you wouldn't be sorting by a container. You wouldn't be doing a query by container. So you could get results as a container, and that was one of the things that we kind of covered here on slide number 3, I believe it is. Yes, down here at the bottom, which is if the file is hosted, if you get returned values that include container fields, you're going to get back URLs that can be used to fetch that with a separate call entirely. It's just going to be a URL. So you would have to deal with insert from URL to actually pull that binary data, right? But if the file is open locally, then what you're going to get back on container fields is just the name of the file. You're not going to get back the binary data.
Okay, I think we're good. Maybe set field text before.
You could create a calculation against that container that would be the base 64 encoded version of that container. Then you could get back that result and use that result to re-encode it back into a file into another container, right? So there's definitely a way around that restriction.
Okay.
Good stuff.
I think we're good. No, people are like, thank you very much. So
next week, we are going to still stay on the theme of execute data API, except we're going to start moving more towards just the external data API. And we're going to be using insert from URL with curl options. So for the next several weeks, we're still going to stay in this theme of dealing with FileMaker data using the data API and/or insert from URL, and we're going to play around with curl options, and eventually we're going to play around in an external app called Postman. And you're going to see probably next week how to pull FileMaker data straight from your terminal using curl. So some advanced concepts that we're going to be playing with, but basically all of this stuff that I'm showing you kind of builds on each other for the next several weeks. So if you miss a week before you come to the next one, you might want to follow up and watch the video because everything kind of follows up on itself. So there's going to be things next week that I'm going to be referring to this class on. So
yes,
keep that in mind.
And that'll be fun. Insert from URLs where all the FileMaker black magic happens if I recall. Or I remember some people doing some really weird stuff with it back in the day when it was added. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you very much, Leland, for presenting. We greatly appreciate it. We will see you all here tomorrow for OCR and the MonkeyBread plugin. So,
cheerio.
Have a good one, everybody.
got a report of an individual up here who may be a FileMaker license. Well, it's potentially expired. Look at the back of that car right there. Looks like the FileMaker license has expired. Sir, I need you to step out of the vehicle. Sir, step out of the vehicle. Sir.